After dedicating 12 years to running my father's company, I had finally grown it to be worth $75 million. But then, at a family dinner, my dad smiled and said to me, "Your brother will take over now." My heart sank, though I managed to return his smile. That very next morning at work, everything changed. I still vividly recall how he smiled that night, his hand resting proudly on my brother's shoulder, as if he'd made up his mind long before he spoke the words that would alter everything. "Your brother will take over now." I felt my stomach drop, but after years of practice, I kept my face calm. I smiled back as if his words hadn't cut me deeply, as if they weren't unraveling a dozen years of my hard work in an instant. The dining room buzzed with the clinking of glasses and soft murmurs between extended family and close business associates. This wasn't just any family dinner. It was a celebration meant to honor everything we had built. Everything I had built. My father had started Harper & Company when I was just a kid, a small logistics business that barely survived its early days. I grew up watching him struggle, working late into the night, missing family vacations, always chasing just one more contract to stay afloat. When I was 24, fresh from business school, he finally let me take a role, though I had to fight hard for that chance. But I didn't just take a role. I transformed Harper & Company from a barely surviving regional logistics firm into a national powerhouse, expanding operations, landing million-dollar deals, and integrating cutting-edge technology. What once was a small, nearly bankrupt business had become an industry leader valued at $75 million. Yet in that moment, none of it seemed to matter. My father had already chosen my brother Ethan to take over, not me. A quiet wave of approval rippled around the table, murmurs of congratulations aimed at Ethan. I watched him lower his eyes, pretending to be modest, but I knew better. Ethan had never truly cared about the business. For the past 10 years, he'd jumped from one failed venture to another, never finding his place. Logistics didn't interest him. Operations didn't interest him. What he wanted was power. I had spent 12 years proving myself, building Harper & Company from scratch, making tough calls, late-night strategy sessions, every contract negotiation. Ethan hadn't done any of that. And yet, here we were. I swallowed my emotions. I'd learned long ago that in this family, showing pain meant weakness. I reached for my wine glass, steadying my hand before raising it. "Smile, Lisa. Smile," I whispered to myself. "To Ethan," I said, voice smooth and controlled. The guests raised their glasses, oblivious to the storm behind my calm eyes. From across the table, my mother glanced at me, a look I couldn't read, but I knew she understood. Unlike my father, she had always seen my effort, but she wouldn't intervene. She never did. And my father, grinning with unwavering confidence, remained blind to the fact that his choice had ignited a fire. Ethan caught my eye across the table, a barely concealed smirk tugging at his lips. That was when I realized this wasn't just my father's decision. Ethan had been waiting for this moment. He'd carefully positioned himself, playing the devoted son who had finally found his calling. And my father, a traditionalist through and through, saw no problem with that logic. A son should inherit the empire. A daughter. Her hard work was always dismissed as temporary, a mere footnote, no matter how fiercely she fought. But what neither of them realized was that I hadn't just spent 12 years building a company. I'd been fortifying my place within it. And tomorrow morning, they would find out exactly what that meant. The sleepless night, that night, sleep evaded me. My mind replayed every sacrifice I'd made for Harper & Company, the late nights, missed birthdays, relationships fractured beneath the weight of my ambition. I had poured everything into this company, and now they expected me to step aside without a fight. They had underestimated me. By 3 a.m., I was in my home office, fingers flying over the keyboard. Every contract, every share certificate, every executive agreement. I knew the company's inner workings better than anyone. Ethan thought the transition would be effortless, that by next week his name would be on the door and his position secure. But what he didn't know was that while my father was busy with public appearances and Ethan was pretending to learn the ropes, I was securing something far more valuable: control. The confrontation. At exactly 8:45 a.m., I arrived at Harper & Company headquarters, just as I had every day for the past 12 years. Same walls, same polished floors, same steady hum of productivity as employees settled into their routines. But today was different. Today, I wasn't just walking into my office. I was stepping into a battlefield. The reception area was unnervingly quiet, the kind of silence that comes before a storm. They knew. The rumors had already spread like wildfire. Employees glanced at me with hesitant looks, avoiding eye contact, unsure whose side to take. I ignored them, walking with steady confidence, heels clicking on marble floors, posture straight. Never let them see you falter. I shut the door behind me, my office, my domain. I had exactly 15 minutes before my father and Ethan would arrive, expecting to assume their new roles as CEO and heir apparent. 15 minutes before everything they planned would collapse. Sitting at my desk, I took a deep breath and powered on my computer. The screen lit up with confidential documents, contracts, and agreements they'd never thought to check, files they assumed didn't matter. I opened the ownership records. My fingers hovered briefly before clicking on the file titled Executive Shareholders Agreement. Then I waited. Right at 9 a.m., a sharp knock sounded at my door. I said nothing. It swung open, and in walked my father and Ethan, both brimming with confidence. My father's natural authority, Ethan's carefully crafted bravado. My father entered like a king surveying his kingdom, while Ethan, dressed in a sharp navy suit, wore a smug, triumphant grin. It took every ounce of restraint not to laugh. "Lisa," my father said in his usual commanding tone, as if he were doing me a favor by acknowledging me. "I assume you're aware of the transition happening today." "Transition?" I smiled. Interesting choice of words. "I'm aware," I replied smoothly, leaning back in my chair. I glanced at Ethan, whose smirk only deepened. "Good," my father continued, nodding as if we were all in agreement. "Ethan will be stepping in as the new CEO. We'll need you to help with the handover, get him up to speed before you officially move on." I raised an eyebrow. "Move on?" I echoed, feigning confusion. "Dad, I think you're mistaken about something." His face twitched with irritation. He was used to my compliance, my quiet acceptance. He wasn't ready for this. "Lisa," he said, voice tight, like talking down to a child. "This isn't up for debate. The decision is final." I smiled slowly, knowingly. "Oh, I know, Dad," I said softly. "The thing is, you don't have the authority to make that decision." Ethan scoffed low, shaking his head. "Lisa, don't make this difficult. We're trying to keep this simple." I said nothing. Instead, I grabbed the remote and pressed a button. The large screen on my office wall lit up, displaying the very document I'd been reviewing earlier. Executive Shareholders Agreement, signed August 17th, 2015. Signatories: Lisa Harper, James Harper, Ethan Harper. My father's face paled slightly. I turned to Ethan. "Do you even know what this document means?" He crossed his arms, shifting uncomfortably. "A shareholders' agreement," he guessed. I nodded. "Yes. And do you understand what it states?" I tapped the screen, highlighting a key clause. This agreement was drawn up during Harper & Company's restructuring. It clearly says that any transfer of executive power, like appointing a new CEO, requires the approval of all majority shareholders. I locked eyes with my father. "And I, Dad, hold 60% of the company's shares." The silence that followed felt crushing. My father's face hardened. "That can't be," Ethan muttered, stepping forward to inspect the document. "Actually, it's very real," I said calmly. "You see, while you were busy failing at every startup you tried, and Dad was busy playing the role of the family patriarch, I was doing something different." I leaned in. I was securing my position. Turning to my father, I reminded him, "Remember 2017, when you needed capital to expand? You signed over an extra 15% of your shares to me for my investment. And in 2019, during that legal dispute, another 10% was transferred under my name as collateral, something you never bothered to reclaim. Adding that to my original 35%, I'm now the majority shareholder." My father's jaw clenched tight. Ethan, however, was visibly panicking. "You've got to be bluffing," he spat out. I pulled out a second paper. "Here's the latest legal filing with the state. Want to check it?" Ethan snatched the document, scanning it quickly. His face drained of color with each line. "This isn't possible," he stammered. "Dad, tell her she can't do this." My father stayed silent. He knew I'd legally outmaneuvered him, and there was nothing he could do. I exhaled slowly and stood. "I'm not firing you, Ethan," I said. "I wouldn't want to throw you into the real job market. But from now on, you'll report to me and work under my leadership. Otherwise," I motioned toward the door, "you're free to leave." Ethan turned to my father, eyes pleading. For the first time ever, my father had no answer. This wasn't his company anymore. It was mine. The aftermath. The silence in my office was suffocating. Ethan still gripped the legal document so tightly his knuckles were white. My father stood stiff beside him, expression unreadable. But I knew better. He was calculating, searching for a way out. There wasn't one. I'd spent years preparing for this moment, not because I expected betrayal, but because I'd learned never to trust loyalty when power was at stake. For the first time ever, my father looked at me as if I were a stranger. Maybe he never really knew me. "So that's it?" Ethan finally broke the silence, bitterness in his voice. "You're just taking everything?" I let out a quiet, humorless laugh. "Taking everything?" I stepped closer. "Ethan, I built this company from nothing. Every contract, every expansion, every innovation, I made it happen. While you were busy failing upwards, I kept this company alive. No, I'm not taking anything. I'm just holding on to what's already mine." Ethan's face twisted with anger, but he had no comeback. He knew I was right. And worse, so did my father. He'd spent years believing bloodline mattered more than ability, that his son should inherit what was rightfully mine. He had underestimated me, and now he was paying the price. My father finally broke the silence. "You're making a mistake, Lisa," he said calmly, though strain showed beneath. "Families should stick together. Do you really want to burn this bridge?" I met his gaze without flinching. "Dad," I said slowly, "you burned that bridge the moment you decided without me." His lips pressed into a thin line. "Business is bigger than one person. We can find a solution that works for everyone." I tilted my head, pretending to consider it. "Oh, I agree. That's why I'm offering you both a choice." Turning to Ethan first, I said smoothly, "You can stay in the company, but not as CEO. You'll have an advisory role with limited power. Your salary will be generous, but you'll report to me." Ethan stiffened, but I pressed on. "Or you can walk away. I'll buy your shares at market value. Take the money and find your next project." My father scoffed. "You act like you hold all the cards." I smiled. "I do." A thick silence followed. I let it hang, letting them feel what it was like to be powerless. Finally, my father sighed, shaking his head in disbelief. "I never thought you'd do this," he muttered. "Not to your own family." His words stung. Not to your own family. I wanted to tell him he'd caused this by pushing me aside, treating me like a temporary placeholder. But I stayed silent, because in the end, it didn't matter. What mattered was I wasn't letting them take what I built. Not now. Not ever. Ethan stormed out first. Good riddance. I knew him well enough to predict his next move. He'd run to relatives and family friends, painting himself as the victim of corporate betrayal. I didn't care. I wasn't here to win their approval. I was here to win my future. My father lingered, as if hoping I'd change my mind. When I didn't, he gave a slow nod. "You've changed," he said quietly. I met his eyes. "No, Dad. I just finally stopped pretending." Then he left. I exhaled and sank into my chair. I should have felt victorious. After all, I'd fought and won my place. But staring at the empty doorway, I felt something else. A quiet ache. Part of me had always craved my father's approval. Some desperate part had hoped that if I worked hard enough, if I proved myself over and over, he'd finally see me. The truth was, he never really had. And now, he had no choice but to see me for who I really was. Not just his daughter, not some temporary stand-in, but the true leader of Harper and Company. Turning back to my computer, I shifted my focus. I'd spent 12 years building this company. Now I'd spend the next 12 making it untouchable. My father and brother tried to take everything from me, but in the end, they were the ones who lost it all. The war begins. For the first time in 12 years, my office felt empty. No calls from my father, no passive-aggressive emails from Ethan. Just silence. But silence didn't mean peace. It meant the fight had started. I knew my father wouldn't step back quietly. And Ethan, he'd fight tooth and nail to reclaim what he thought was his birthright. I wasn't foolish enough to think it was over. It had only just begun. By the next morning, I could feel the unease spreading through the company. Employees who had greeted me confidently the week before now seemed hesitant, afraid to take sides. Some department heads avoided my gaze. I knew what was happening. My father and Ethan were working the rumor mill. Old family friends, board members, senior executives. They were sowing doubt, casting me as cold, ruthless, disloyal. Ethan had taken on the role of wounded son, betrayed by his sister. I could picture him now, sitting in some upscale restaurant, feigning sorrow as he told investors how I'd stolen the company from him. And my father? He didn't have to say much. Just a heavy sigh, a shaking head, carefully chosen words. I only ever wanted the best for my children. It was a dangerous game. If they convinced the board and top executives to turn against me, they could push me out, or at least make my leadership impossible. I wasn't about to let that happen. That afternoon, I called an emergency executive meeting. Walking into the boardroom, I felt the tension thick in the air. Half the room avoided my eyes. The other half stared, waiting for me to falter. I took my seat at the head of the table. My seat. "Let's not waste time," I said evenly. "I know there have been whispers, behind closed doors, over drinks, in hushed conversations." I scanned the room, letting my gaze land long enough on each person to make them shift. "I also know some of you are questioning whether my leadership can last." A few stiffened. No one spoke. I tapped my fingers against the polished table. "Let's clear that up now." I pulled up a presentation on the screen. Numbers, data, facts. I took this company from a struggling regional player to a $75 million industry leader. In the last 5 years under my leadership, revenue has tripled and we've entered 6 new markets. I turned to the CFO. "Paul, is there any financial indicator suggesting this company is in trouble under my leadership?" Paul hesitated, then shook his head. "No. In fact, projections show another 20% growth next quarter." I nodded. "So let's be honest about what's really going on here." Leaning forward, I continued, My father and brother aren't upset because the company is failing. They're upset because they expected me to step aside and let Ethan take over, regardless of his qualifications, regardless of results. The room was silent. Then I dropped the real bomb. I also know some of you were contacted in the past 24 hours, offered incentives to push for my resignation. I tilted my head. If anyone wants to disclose those conversations, now's the time. A few shifted uncomfortably. After a pause, a senior executive cleared his throat. I got a call, he admitted. From your father. He said he might appeal to the board. I nodded, unsurprised. Did he offer anything for your support? A pause, a slow nod. That's it, I said, standing. My father built this company. I respect that. But I took it further than he ever could, and I won't let him manipulate it from outside. My voice dropped, calm, but dangerous. If he wants a fight, he'll get one. I gathered my papers, locking eyes with each executive. If anyone believes my father and brother deserve control, now's the time to act. Silence. No one moved. Good. I turned and walked out, head held high. This wasn't just about keeping my company. It was about making sure they never thought they could take it away from me again. That night, I made my own call, not to the board, not to investors, but to the media. By morning, every major news outlet's business section carried the same headline: Power shift at Harper & Co. Lisa Harper outmaneuvers family in boardroom battle. I had made my move. Now it was their turn, and I was ready. The media war. The morning after my story broke, my inbox flooded. Emails, missed calls, messages from journalists, investors, and board members. Some offered support, others sounded cautious, but nearly all asked the same question. Is it true? I made them wait. I understood the game my father was playing. Decades spent mastering public perception meant he knew reputation carried weight. Unable to defeat me in the boardroom, he aimed to undermine me in the court of public opinion, and that was exactly what he set out to do. By noon, the first counterattack arrived, a carefully crafted press release, polite but full of half-truths. Harper & Company has always been a family-run business. We regret recent events, but remain committed to the values that built this company. Leadership changes are inevitable, and we hope to ensure a smooth transition. Subtle, but clear. Lisa is reckless. Lisa is unstable. Lisa is not a team player. I wasn't surprised. I was furious. In my office, I watched analysts debate my leadership on TV. Was Lisa Harper too aggressive in her takeover? Will her lack of cooperation hurt the company long term? Can she recover from this PR disaster? They spoke as if I wasn't listening, as if I wasn't already planning my next move. Because if my father and Ethan wanted a public war, I was more than ready to give them one. I didn't release a statement or hold a press conference. Instead, I made one call to a trusted investigative journalist. I have something for you, I said, but you need to move fast. An hour later, I sent over documents, emails, financial reports, internal records, proof that under my father's leadership, Harper & Company had engaged in questionable business practices. Practices I'd spent years quietly fixing. Within 24 hours, the story broke. Behind the scenes at Harper & Company, a legacy of hidden debts and financial cover-ups. The article was brutal. It praised my leadership for restoring the company's financial health, criticized my father's past mismanagement, and made one thing clear. I was the reason Harper & Company survived. Suddenly, the narrative shifted. The board stopped doubting me. Investors stopped hesitating. And my father, he had nowhere left to hide. 2 days later, my father finally called. I let it ring thrice before answering. "Lisa," he said, voice tight, "we need to talk." I leaned back. "Do we?" Silence. Then a sigh. "You didn't have to do that." I chuckled softly. Neither did you. This company was supposed to be a legacy, he said, for the family, for both of you. A pang hit me. Once, a foolish part of me had wanted that too. But not anymore. Dad, I said quietly, if you wanted me to protect that legacy, you should have trusted me with it. Instead, you tried to take it from me. Long silence. Then, almost reluctantly, he asked, "What happens now?" I exhaled slowly. Now? I make sure no one can ever touch my company again. The war was over. My father lost. Ethan vanished. And I won. Yet, as I stared out over the city skyline from my office, I felt no triumph. Just emptiness. I had fought 12 years for Harper and Company, building it, protecting it, making it stronger than ever. But the cost? I lost something else along the way. My family. Victory and its price. The next day, I walked into the office as if nothing had changed. But everyone knew the truth. The whispers stopped. Doubts faded. I was no longer just Lisa Harper, CEO. I was Lisa Harper, the woman who outplayed her father and brother and came out on top. Some respected me. Some feared me. And some, they still waited for me to fall. I let them wait. At noon, my father and I met in the conference room for our final conversation. He looked tired, older, as if the weight of everything had settled on him. I waited for him to speak first. When he did, his voice was quieter than ever. "I'm retiring," he said simply. "Effective immediately." I didn't react. I expected this. "I'll sell my remaining shares," he went on. "Keep a small stake as investor, but no longer involved." I studied him. "And Ethan?" His jaw tightened. "He's gone. Took the buyout. Won't be back." A part of me had expected this. Ethan was never strong enough to fight. Once he knew he lost, he ran. Like always. Still, hearing it aloud made something ache inside. Not regret or guilt, just finality. I nodded. Understood. My father rubbed his temple, like a headache was settling in. Then, after a pause, he said something I never thought I'd hear. "I underestimated you." Not an apology, but the closest I'd ever get. Strangely, I didn't need it anymore. Building the empire. A month later, Harper and Company was unrecognizable. The old board members loyal to my father and Ethan? Gone. Executives who questioned me. Replaced. The company was strong under my leadership, but now it was truly mine. With control came vision. I introduced initiatives Dad rejected, modernized systems he'd dismissed, expanded into industries he feared. 6 months in, profits soared. A year later, revenue passed $100 million. For the first time, I wasn't just fighting to prove myself. I was building something no one could ever take away again. Reconciliation. A year later, I had dinner with my father, the first time since he retired. He seemed different, quieter. No anger, only acceptance. "I read about your latest deal," he said over his drink. "Smart move." I smirked. "I know." A faint smile touched his lips. No tension, no war left. Just the truth. He tried to push me aside, and I proved him wrong. He raised his glass. "To Harper and Company." This time, when I clinked my glass with his, there was no anger, only peace. Because I'd already won, and I didn't need his approval to know it. Reflection. Now, sitting in my office, overlooking the city where I built my empire, I think about the lessons I've learned. Family can be your fiercest enemy. Loyalty is a currency, not a guarantee. Power is never given. It's taken. And sometimes, the best way to prove your worth is to stop seeking validation and build something so strong they can't ignore you. No regrets. Harper and Company is mine now, and I intend to make sure no one ever forgets it.